So to begin today, we wanted to share an excerpt from Stanford's Social Innovation Review's article, Why Intersectional Stories Are Key to Helping the Communities We Serve, which will help us tee up our discussion around why movements need stories. Great stories help us understand systemic issues because they transport us into the lives of the characters. We see the world through their eyes, and we are changed by their experiences because they feel like our own. Great stories can counter existing beliefs by rewriting someone's understanding. They can help communities radically imagine new ways of being and seeing. So with that, once again, my name is Bree. I'm the Tech Reform Digital Community Engagement Manager at Exposure Labs, where my focus is on our program's digital communications, community engagements, and special events. Prior to joining Exposure Labs in 2017, just a little bit more about myself, with the launch of our film Chasing Coral, I served as the Director of PR and Social Media for MOPS, a global platform for moms to connect and share their lives and journeys together, and was founder and director of Fellow Magazine, a print publication that leveraged storytelling and curated events to showcase local creators across the Denver, Colorado region. And I'm also the co-founder of an events production firm called The Convivialists, which can be quite a mouthful to say, but means for those who are fond of feasting, drinking, and entertaining merry company, which also happens to be where you can find myself and what I can be doing outside of the workplace with my community and family. Speaking of family, that's where it all kind of began for me in this work, growing up in a super large Italian family where I firsthand saw the impacts of how simple acts like cooking and gathering and dining together can create a sense of community, identity, and belonging. And I've essentially just been passionate about building experiences that bring people together ever since, particularly through storytelling. And Julie, I'll kick it off to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Bree, for that setup. I really love that. My name is Hoppock. I'm the Director of Partnerships for our Tech Reform program at Exposure Labs, which is based around the social dilemma and its impact campaign. And just a little bit about Exposure Labs, in case you don't know, it's a very unique hybrid impact and production studio. So on top of creating original documentaries like The Social Dilemma, Chasing Coral, which you may have seen, Exposure Labs also hires a team of advocates like Bree and myself to help ensure that those stories can be used as tools in the movements they serve. So we'll get into more about what we do and how those stories fuel movements. But prior to Exposure Labs, I directed and produced videos for the Pew Charitable Trust, which is an advocacy organization. And that was all about, how we can conserve our planet and advance awareness about public health issues. I have always loved stories. I've always been a writer. I've always been behind the camera with like a camcorder as a kid, making bad music videos. So I've always been into it, and finally found the job I wanted, where I can do that in a more professional way and not make such a fool myself. And before all that, I was in journalism. So yeah, just so thrilled to be here today. And at Exposure Labs, our missions are stories for a better future. And there's no better way to do that than to really help support the next generation of storytellers. So that's why we're so thrilled to be partnering with LookUp Live, and we have this Social Dilemma Storyteller Award that we've awarded to 3 people that are on this call today. So I'd actually love to just kick it off to them. And Ryan, I'll start with you, and I'm hoping that each of you can talk about your project and why stories are important to you. So Ryan, do you want to kick it off and just unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'll talk about just like why I started, like why I think stories are so important. It's like really important to connect you to the impacts that are affecting you. And I think I first started this work when I realized that I was struggling with my mental health, especially during coronavirus. And I found that, just using over excessive social media was shifting my values to like the group values. And I just cared about getting attention. And that's when I started to realize that it was part of a bigger systematic issue, and that I wanted to do something about it. And I wanted to show people how their lives were being impacted by this. So that's why we started working on this project. And I think Michele, if she could tell us more about the project that we're doing.
Hi, yes, thanks for that setup, Brian. Basically, I think that our documentary really helps highlight kind of the self-growth and the positive aspects of what handling social media in a responsible way can really bring to a person's life, as specifically shown through all of these artists' artworks. We're going to ask some of our recruits to quit for a month from any kind of social media platform and to just in that time that normally they would be falling through that rabbit hole of TikTok, Instagram, whatever it might be, to instead implement their time more usefully into their work and see kind of what comes from it. And I think that the storytelling aspect of it, at least for me, my passion behind storytelling relies heavily on the fact that we can help bring awareness to things, we can help educate people in a way that's meaningful, but also extremely engaging if used correctly and creatively. So I'll pass it on to Yoelle.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle and Ryan. I think those are some really great points. I can begin by introducing myself. My name is Yoelle. I'm a sophomore at the Washington University in St. Louis, and I consider myself a human connection filmmaker. So right now, I'm working on a film titled Our Subscription to Addiction, and I essentially consider it a sort of youth response to the social dilemma, focusing on how youth are really driving the future of this movement. And it's a very much a solutions-based documentary, so with interviews from youth on their experiences with social media, as well as interviews with the digital tech advocates, many featured at lookup.live, and as well as the experiences of social media influencers. So really focusing on three separate groups of youth and their experiences with social media, and how we can tie that into a story that is compelling and impactful for other youth to learn about the movements being created and play a part. And I also want to speak on a little bit about sort of why I think storytelling is important. I kind of fell in love with filmmaking last year when I picked up a camera for the first time. And I think it really proved to me that, for example, in a documentary, you could portray as many statistics as you want, but if you tell a compelling story, that's ultimately what people will resonate with the most deep down. So for me, I think storytelling is a way to sort of tap into our shared human experience and use that as a way for other people to connect with one another, to understand others' experiences, and really deep down be moved by these stories in order to be motivated to act and to join these movements specifically in regards to social media. So thank you for the opportunity, and I'm very excited for this call.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Yoelle. I think Bree and I probably feel the same way, that we may learn more from you three than you learn from us. We're so impressed and excited to be involved in your projects. And Yoelle, you set us up perfectly. So today we're talking about storytelling in movements, but why do movements need stories? So just like Yoelle was saying, stories can help make the issue personal and relatable. There's actually some science that looks at the way your the way your brain processes when you hear a personal story. It lights up the same pathways as if you were experiencing that story yourself. So in order to make change in a movement, it's good to make the issue personal first to really affect change. And so that's something that happens that's really interesting. Stories are more memorable than statistics, like Yoelle was kind of alluding to. I think there's a stat out there that, again, maybe you won't remember it, but that a story well told is like a message told through a story is 22 times more memorable than a stat. Stories allow the movement to see itself. That is so important. You'll hear us talk about that more today. But, if you hear from others that are also maybe feeling cruddy after scrolling on Instagram and you realize you're not alone, that is actually part of movement building. And so even just the act of sharing a story can be a core seed in building a movement. Stories can reinforce a vision for a better future. We can talk about solutions, we can envision solutions, and they can create the conditions for change. I love this because I think on its own, a story doesn't change the world, but a story does indeed create the conditions. It can change an emotion, it can spark a new idea, and it can be the seed that begins a really powerful movement.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Julia. And as a snapshot, to give you an overview of our storytelling and impact campaigns, for our impact work, we often reference with appreciation Doc Society's framework of 4 campaign dynamics to assess how films and stories can make an impact. And these 4 are building community, which essentially is providing that focal point around which people come together. Grassroots organizing is a great example of this, but there are many other kinds of community building out there. Changing minds, creating a shift in public attitudes, creating that mass awareness and understanding, changing behaviors, actively mobilizing people to do different, not just think different, like buying or boycotting, making a donation or volunteering or other actions of that type. And then changing structures, for example, structures in politics or business. It can look like directly influencing law and policy to change the context of the conversation. We really wanted to share that impact field guide from Doc Society with you, and I'll be dropping that in the chat. really quickly. Then next, to provide more of context of how stories are critical for the movement building and social change, we'll head into a deep dive and explain how the film and impact campaign affected change. But first, for those that haven't seen The Social Dilemma, we wanted to share a quick background synopsis with y'all. The film was released on Netflix in fall 2019 and features insiders from Google, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, revealing the ways in which the business model of big social is degrading the fabric of society by damaging our mental health, eroding our shared sense of truth, and threatening our democracy.
Great, thank you, Bree. So before we embarked on this impact campaign, and even before the film was released, we did a landscape analysis. We basically looked at what stories were out there in the field and where we could best fill in any gaps. This is an important thing to do, whether you're starting an advocacy campaign or whether you're starting your own video or storytelling project. You really want to ensure what stories are missing, what stories are needed. Am I the right person to tell this story? And who else is in the space, both thinking through like collaborating either on a creative end or maybe on an advocacy end. So we did that with the impact campaign in mind. And this is sort of what we found out before we launched the film and helped guide our initial impact campaign goals. One was that general public awareness was low. People knew there was a problem with social media. They understood that how they felt, that they maybe felt addicted or they were experiencing, bad mental health effects, but they didn't know, it wasn't widely known how the business model directly impacted that. So we kind of knew there was a niche of something we could talk about there and help spread awareness. We also took a look at the tech reform movement. There have been countless activists and academics that have been ringing the alarm bells, honestly, on this issue since the 80s. They've all been out there, but the movement as a whole was young. It still hadn't gained steam in the mainstream media and just in the big spotlight, and it was still fragmented. There were a lot of people out there, but we weren't all calling for the same thing. So there seemed like there was an opportunity there to unite. We also felt that we were collectively at this tipping point. The film came out just as COVID was really starting, and it just further illuminated how much we rely on these platforms like search and social media to connect with everyone, but at the same time, how much they were controlling our lives. So we really were at a unique moment where the film could make a splash. And so with all of that, we looked at all those conditions and we helped see where our place could be in the movement and how we could craft an impact campaign. And we really just came to find out that we could help further put this issue on the map and really help tell stories that could advance what some of these activists and advocates have been already saying, and help just bring it into the mainstream awareness. Oops. So with all that in mind, we crafted our impact campaign goals before the film was launched with this in mind. So really just knowing that we needed to put the issue on the map. Our main theory of change, which is kind of like your North Star or guiding light for an impact campaign or for an organization's mission, was to catalyze conversations about changing the way tech is designed, regulated, and used. We wanted tech companies to think about how they design these products. We wanted policymakers to wake up to the fact that we need to hold them accountable. And we wanted users to see how those platforms were using them and maybe think about personal changes they'd want to make. So really the goals at first were just to drive this message at scale. And that was through the film itself. That was through continuing the conversation through a lot of virtual screenings we held. We created tools on our website and film discussion guides, all to help advance the conversation. And those were the main goals when we started. Within about 4 months of the film being released, it really gained traction pretty quickly and beyond our wildest imagination. And within the first month, 38 million households watched the film on Netflix, and that broke some records for them in terms of the kind of traction documentaries see. Okay, so there's just more stats here that basically all say the same thing. We were a little bit surprised, and pleasantly so, that the film gained traction and that awareness about the issue was already gaining steam. So with that, we figured we needed to retool our impact campaign because we'd already achieved a goal of raising awareness. How else could we push the needle? So knowing that people were already talking about this issue and the film is being watched by so many people, we thought we could level up a little bit and not only tell people about the problem, but really leverage the power of storytelling to put pressure on big social's business model. So we could sustain public pressure through content and campaigns, our newsletters, and through petitions that we would organize with our tech reform partners. We could do that through building political will for bipartisan reform of big social's business models. We had a lot of policymakers come to us after watching the film. We'll get into that later. And the third and most important is empowering young people to demand and create better tech through education and activation. All of you on this call, part of Gen Z, grew up on the platforms don't know life before social media, right? So you are the people that are most impacted by these platforms. You need to have a voice at the table about how we can reform that. So we really wanted to make that a big part of our campaign goals. So this is the start of our deep dive into the impact campaign and how we did all the things we just talked about we wanted to do. And so we're going to cover in this section how we helped raise awareness, how we engaged our community, how we built partnerships and supported the movement at large, how we engaged policymakers, and how we empowered young people, time permitting. All right, so on this first one about awareness, we already talked about that the film was widely viewed and that was great. But so we knew people were watching the film, but we also wanted to make sure they were learning something from it. And we actually engaged with the Norman Lear Center, which is a nonprofit that studies the impact of media on our politics, on our behavior, on our society at large. And just hot off the presses, we've released that report that studied the impact of the film. And they were able, one of the things they studied was how does viewers' awareness of the problem of the attention extraction economy and the business model of social media compare from viewers of the film to people who didn't view the film. And what they did find was that viewers of the film were much more knowledgeable about the problem, really explicitly understood how tech companies were monetizing their behavior and their attention, and they were more apt to call and want regulation. So one thing we know for sure is that, we were able to help raise awareness about the issue through the film. And knowing that that was happening already, a big goal of our impact campaign in this phase was just to increase access to the film beyond people who have Netflix. So some of the ways we did that just simply by translating the content on our website and our other materials, so non-English speakers had access. We also released 9 supplemental clips, which I think Bree may drop a link in the chat. And those covered films, those dove deeper into themes we covered in the films that were publicly available. Everything from choosing technology mindfully to what happens to your brain on social media, et cetera. And then finally, we were able to work with Netflix and get a limited release of the full film on YouTube. And this happened just at the time that the Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, came out and released all these documents that showed that Facebook, now Meta, understood the ways in which their products were harming people. And so we were able to get the film out on YouTube during that critical time. And during that time, about 1.5 million people watched it. And then beyond that, we also tried to give educators access to the film beyond the Netflix paywall. And that was something we were able to accomplish. So all of that was just to help further spread awareness.
On engaging our community, our goal in this work is to meet people where they're at to help make educational resources on the issues surrounding the social dilemma more easily available, really to connect our work and the work of others in the tech reform space with our community of partners, collaborators, and film audiences. Ultimately, to weave these communities together and taking collective action in the tech reform movement. We do this by several ways. First and foremost, fostering public education. We've supported more than 5,000 community screenings around the film in 130 plus countries, including updating our resources and communicating with event hosts about their plans. Young people and educators are the groups reaching out to our team the most, and more than 64% of our community screening requests come from educators. So to respond to this interest, we edited and released the 40-minute educational cut of the film and an accompanying Gen Z guide and educator resources to increase the accessibility of this film for this audience specifically, and we'd love to share that with you all. I am going to drop that so you guys can check out our Gen Z action guide. Would love to hear what you all think about that. In addition, we created and curated tools and resources to help with behavior change, like our social media reboot, a drip campaign designed to help people take back control of their relationship with technology. Drop you that link too. We're expanding the narrative by integrating and prioritizing news stories of those not represented in the film that are most impacted by these extractive technologies to broaden the movement. And we're striving to cultivate self-actualization and leadership. And last but not least, hope by amplifying stories of change makers, rebooters, and young leaders like y'all leading the humane tech movement and offering resources and pathways for others to join. We'll share more examples of that along in the chat. And finally, we're cultivating inspiration and action around solutions with our community by providing a steady drumbeat of news and updates through a monthly newsletter, op-eds, and even social media content that keeps our audience apprised of how the tech reform movement is evolving. I think before kicking it back to Julia, I wanted to share a real life engagement example too of how stories can fuel movements and how we've seen the social dilemma show up in the local community setting to ignite awareness and action. This group of people in Grand Junction have been meeting to talk about differences and divides and how that they can become bridges in a prosperous community. A local organizer, Jay Seaton, publisher of a local newspaper, facilitated these conversations from all different occupations, political identities, and walks of life. Each member that joined this conversation watched the social dilemma and held a panel discussion with our film's creators after to discuss the issues and learn how to take action locally. We'll drop the full story, but as a takeaway here, one of the things that stories can do for a movement is to help create that shared narrative and establish that common ground amongst divides and differences, as we've already talked about. And we've seen this time and time again in our work, and I know this is going to be incredibly crucial to continue to grow this kind of engagement in the movement as we move forward.
Great. Thanks so much, Bree. Our community and our audience is so important, and Bree has done an excellent job tracking that, and we've evolved our campaign over time to make sure that we're incorporating those views and ideas into our program. So another big pillar of our impact work is developing partnerships and coalition work, and we've really realized over this process that there's such power in uniting groups, organizations, and likely allies, groups with different thoughts under one large umbrella, calling for one big message and just uniting under some common framing. So one of the coalitions that we're a part of is the Ban Surveillance Advertising Coalition. And this is a global coalition of advocates that are calling to prohibit the toxic practice that we get displayed in the social dilemma. So it's really about the business model and how we can ban it. And that's targeted advertising to people based on your identity and behavior, all those things that they track by scraping up your data. And so yeah, basically leaning into kind of where we can best plug into this movement as storytellers and as connectors, we really supported the Ban Surveillance Advertising Coalition, which is led by a group called Accountable Tech. They're phenomenal. If you're interested in tech reform issues, please look them up. But we really supported them just through storytelling, through explaining what surveillance advertising is to our community, to making our community aware about events that this coalition was hosting and petitions they had. And I think that actually we were one of the largest signature drivers to their website for this petition to ban surveillance advertising, which I highly recommend you all do, and add your names too if you want. But yeah, basically we know that we had the privilege of this large platform, and so that's one way we were able to help this coalition. And we also hosted some rallies with them and did some other fun events. But basically, in 1 year, the Ban Surveillance Advertising Coalition just turned a year old. A lot has happened. There's been legislation introduced in Congress. That was just recent. They passed an amendment in the EU that bans surveillance advertising for special groups, so groups based on their sexuality or their political identity. And that actually passed as an amendment in the Digital Service Act in the EU, which is like a huge piece of legislation that will really actually reshape how technology functions here as well. I won't go into too many details, but just know that there is some work to get the Federal Trade Commission to actually to prohibit the practice of surveillance advertising as a rule. That's sort of like wonky, but suffice it to say, there's a lot of momentum in the policy space. And this is a really exciting time. And that just even, being able to collaborate with them on actions and tell the story to our community has helped advance this movement. And I think the biggest thing that's happened over the year is that something I pulled this actually from this Wired article you'll see is a fringe idea has become mainstream. So this idea of banning surveillance advertising is now actually something people are talking about in the news, in the media. You see these headlines here, and politicians are talking about it. President Biden actually mentioned it in his State of the Union, which I will get to in the next slide. And we're running okay on time, so I'm going to go ahead and also just give you a brief summary of some of our other coalition work, and just to help explain even further how stories can support the movement. We're also part of a coalition called the Design with Kids in Mind campaign. And this is a group of advocates that are really looking to create a design code in the US that would prioritize children's rights. It's pretty cool. In the UK, they already have something like this. Essentially, it says any digital platform that young people are likely to be on needs to be designed with their well-being in mind. So yes, there is a YouTube for Kids that has safeguards for kids, but kids go on YouTube, regular YouTube. So how do we track that? How do we see that? And how do we create an experience for them that doesn't serve them targeted advertising or doesn't addict them and use addictive persuasive design techniques to keep them on the platform. So that's what this coalition is doing, and we help actually craft messaging with them and campaigns, and we also help connect them to policymakers that can advance some of their legislative goals. And just again, in the past, I would say year, really, they've helped advance privacy legislation in Congress for kids. Susan mentioned something in California. There's actually an age-appropriate design code bill, which is what this is all calling for, that is just being introduced in California. I think they just did the testimony yesterday. And then just the power of people coming together. In this same coalition, many of the advocates here called on Facebook to cancel their plans for an Instagram for kids. This was something they were debating doing, and it was public. And then kind of after the Frances Haugen papers came out, Facebook announced they were going to pause these plans. So again, just the power of having, all these people come out and say, we didn't want this, doctors, mental health experts, parents, et cetera, really helped make a difference. And then finally, what I alluded to in the last slide is that, President Biden is talking about this issue now. In the State of the Union, he said, it's time to hold social media companies accountable for the national experiment they're conducting on our children for profit. So then he went on to propose that we invest more money into studying the mental health impacts of social media, and that we do a whole host of other measures I won't bore you with, but they're all very aligned with what this coalition is calling for, and they'll all help respect children's rights online. So things are happening, and stories are all a part of it, and we're just really thrilled to be part of the movement. And then also, finally, I want to talk a little bit about youth empowerment. So that was another big goal of our campaign, was how can we help empower young people to both demand and to create better tech? And so one of the main ways we do that is just supporting activists like all of you that are already doing this work. And so we have this spotlight here. It's a Changemaker Spotlight, which is a nice feature that Bree started on our website that features changemakers in the movement. So we featured Maddie Freeman, and Maddie has a challenge called No So November, which challenges young people to take the month of November off from social media to see how it affects their mental health. And I'll get into her story a little later, but we helped mentor her, and we also worked with our grant last year with the LookUp.live was about helping award teams that were helping to realign technology with the public good, including lots of different kinds of activists. So we help mentor and support them. And then, as Bree mentioned, we also just create resources that are tailored for young people. And we also launched a debate program this year with Newsweek and the National Association of the Urban Debate League. And this is really just an initiative to combat the hate, polarization and just kind of heat that you see exacerbated on social media platforms by fostering a debate about how we should regulate social media platforms. So the Washington Urban Debate League and Boston Urban Debate League headed off, and they debated how they should regulate big social. And then we also invited all the participants to submit a 2-minute video to policymakers to say how they should regulate. And we're going to share that with them, because we know for sure that stories by communities most impacted really make a difference and can help sway those in power. And then on top of that, we just try to foster more debate and build community, with young people through events like this, so that we can all work towards a common goal. All right, so moving right along, we also, a big goal of ours was to engage policymakers and to help build bipartisan political will for reform. And so, as I mentioned, really after the film launched, policymakers were calling our office and saying, from all over the world, and saying, I saw the film, what do I do about it? And so over time, we realized our best place was by sharing stories, by screening the film, and by connecting them to the experts that we had met in the process of making the film and in crafting this campaign. And so throughout that process, we reached 200 plus policymakers through screenings, and probably 70 more in their staff through briefings. This picture on the left is a screenshot of a screening of the social dilemma that we did with the Democratic Caucus of Congress right before they held a hearing with Mark Zuckerberg, with Jack Dorsey, formerly of Twitter, and Sundar Pichai of Google, so that they could be prepared to ask good questions for these tech execs. So that was a huge thing. And something else that we did that's not on screen right now is we also briefed a Republican member of Congress, Representative Kathy McMorris Rodgers, who sat on this committee that was also going to be questioning these tech execs. And she wanted to hear from us before doing that. And so we did a little bit of a briefing call with her, and we actually mentioned Maddie's story. Now, Maddie created this challenge, Maddie Freeman in the last slide, because she unfortunately lost several friends to suicide. And after watching The Social Dilemma, kind of started to think, I wonder what role social media may have played in like the mental health of myself and of my friends. And that was something she wanted to look into more. And we mentioned this to the Congresswoman, and her staff told us that she thought about it all week. And then when it came down to the day that she was giving her opening remarks before questioning these tech execs, she mentioned Maddie's story, not by name, but she mentioned the story, and she included some of the stats that we shared with her. But that to me was like, that's an example of how a personal story can affect those in power. And if you ever were to watch, I don't know why you'd go back to C-SPAN and watch this, because you're not a nerd like me, maybe you are, but you'll see that she was just so fired up and passionate about it. She's a mom herself. This was a personal issue. And it's just, to me, the biggest example of how a personal story can affect change. So throughout this process, we've been able to develop some relationships with members of Congress and policymakers, and been able to advise on bills and connect them with experts, and really just have seen a ton of momentum that I could go on for a long time, but I won't. Just suffice it to say that there's a lot of things happening, and there really is starting to be a will for reform. All right, so basically, we just kind of went through what our campaign kind of was over the last year, and we learned a lot from that process. So we learned the power of listening to our audience and finding out what they really need from us, listening to the movement and building in coalitions and uniting around a common theme, and telling stories of those most impacted and sharing those with people in power. So that was a lot of great work. And as we get further away from when The Social Dilemma was launched, it was January 2020, we're reflecting on what's the next phase of our program. And what we really found is that we need more stories, and we need more stories of hope. I have a little time, so I'll go into another anecdote of the Norman Lear study that we did. But one of the things we found out was that people did, after watching The Social Dilemma, feel afraid and scared, and that they were more aware of the problem, and they did want regulation, and those were all good things. But that people who felt more hopeful were more likely to take civic action, like sharing their story or donating to an organization, etc. So we've learned that, we've illustrated the problem, but hope is such an important part to mobilize the movement as well. So as we shift into this next era of our program, we're really hoping to tell stories of hope. And another thing we know is that there just needs to be more stories. A lot of our partners are telling this. And so we're heading into an era where we want to really support the tech reform storytelling ecosystem in any way we can. So our new theory of change is really to leverage the power of storytelling to add capacity and advance the tech reform movement. And one of the ways we'll do this is by producing our own original short form videos, rather than waiting another 2 to 3 years for another feature-length documentary. Those take a long time. We can better respond to the movement if we can create these 2 to 3 minute videos. And we're starting that work now. We've just hired a team to help develop these stories. And what's cool is it's all going to be sourced from our partners and our allies. We've already talked to them to see what stories do you need, what would be helpful, and we're going to work with them very closely as we produce this. So we're very excited about that. And I'll pass it off to Bree to talk a little bit about Storyteller Support.
Thanks, Julia, for that explanation. I think to add to that, we're shaping this new arm of the program that Julia shared about, and part of it is going to build on the work we're doing here with the LookUp Live mentoring and supporting folks like Michele, Ryan, and Yoelle with the Storyteller Award program and mentorship. We're super excited about that. Also, as a side note, we're excited to bring a program manager onto our team to further build out a program that can connect tech storytellers to the funding, resources, and support they need to make an impact. We know everybody has a story to tell, and we want to help them get it out there into the world. So I think with that, Julia, if this sounds good to you, we'll kick off our Q&A portion with a question each from, Yoelle, Ryan, and Michele. And then we'll open it up to the full audience. So when y'all have a question, just drop your question into the chat, and I believe Sam was going to help queue that up. And with that, Yoelle, I'm going to actually pass it over to you, my team, to start and kick us off with a question.
Sure, thank you.
Go team.
Yes, I guess, my question is, Julia and Bree, what do you think are some ways to innovate the current practice of storytelling?
That's a good question. Julie, I'm happy to take this one too. Broadly, I think creating stories that are more accessible to all audiences. For example, the now Oscar-winning Best Film CODA, an acronym that stands for Child of Deaf Adult. I'm not sure if any of y'all had a chance to see it yet, but it features 3 main deaf roles that are played by deaf actors. And it was released in theaters with open captions that were displayed on screen for all viewers, regardless of their ability to hear. And just generally, I think accessibility has become incredibly important in telling inclusive stories. And there's a lot of room in the storytelling space right now to grow and innovate here.
Yeah, I think there's enough time so I can jump in as well,
Yeah.
Yoelle. It's a great question. And yeah, Bree, thank you for mentioning CODA. I actually haven't seen it yet, and it's top on my list. But Yoelle, I think one thing I'm excited about, or one way we could innovate more, is by kind of thinking about where we source our stories, right? And making sure we're not just in our same echo chamber. So really giving those, like, the people, our film subjects, if you will, which sometimes I wonder if we should change that word, but giving them more agency in the storytelling themselves. And so actually involving them in the process more, which I know is a little bit of an interesting concept with documentary filmmaking and having editorial control, but we're just at a place where I think that's something to explore. And we're currently exploring that now with the way that we're sourcing ideas for our short form content. We really want these to serve the movement, so we have to ask the movement. And so it's a bit of an experiment, but I think I'm just excited about new models of how we source stories and how we have more reciprocity in our storytelling with our film subjects.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Michele, I see you dropped a question here. I can read that out.
If you want, I can read it. Yeah, I just didn't know if we were going or commenting. Yeah, so because me and Ryan have recently been interviewing a lot of people to be a part of our documentary, I think something that we find difficult is really being able to dig beneath, just the, oh yeah, I can relate to that. I use social media for this and that also when I was young, like you said, personal real life stories, that those are the kinds of things that bring so much attention and are extremely relatable and actually get people to feel. So my question would be, how do you achieve being able to make the person you're interviewing or talking to feel comfortable enough to reveal such information about themselves?
Totally. I'm happy to jump in, Bree, if that works.
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I know we talked about this a little bit in our call, but that is that's all about building trust ahead of time. And that's where the tension between trying to stay on deadline and meet your production deadlines can kind of hit with how you also just need to operate at the speed of trust. Those conversations only happen when you build trust with your film subject, with your interviewee, and made them feel safe. And you can do that in a number of ways. One is building in time ahead of time to get to know them, ask them, like, be transparent about how this process is going to work, ask them what they want to get out of it. And sometimes revealing something personal about your own experience with social media in those settings can help them feel comfortable to reveal something themselves. But that's one of those things to consider. And in order to get more of those deeper moments, you need time to build trust. So you may make that decision that rather than interviewing all 10, 15, whatever amount of people, I'm going to focus and really build relationships with 3 people. And the ones that really we're connecting will run with the interview. But that's it really is all about the time and then creating that environment in the interview setting. And so that's where, like, I think sometimes we can get stuck in, I want to ask all these questions and I've got my clipboard here and, like, you have all this stuff in mind, but you have to remember that it's a conversation and the person on the other side of the camera is afraid. They've got lights flashing in their face and all these cameras in front of them, and you're asking them to reveal something personal. So as much as you can make it more conversational, maybe put your clipboard down and just be present, that also will make them feel more comfortable.
Yeah, Julie, I'll just second that. I just, in building a relationship, it is really important to also be vulnerable yourself. And, seconding what you said, it's about being willing to share your own story. I heard someone said we meet each other on the edge of our own knowing. And so when we get an opportunity to share in each other's story and create an experience together, I think that's really where the magic happens.
Yeah, I can ask my question now. Mine's more related to, like, I'm seeing the social dilemma and, like, all those sides you guys presented, and it's like it's incredible, like, the impact that social dilemma is able to have. But now I feel like we have the power, right? Everyone can like tell their story because everyone has their phone and they can reach anyone as well. And I'm wondering like, how can we work to like make sure that we're connecting these stories to people and they can understand like what they can do? Because I feel like so much now is there's like so much learned helplessness. Like you're seeing like what's going on in Ukraine, and to so many people, it's just like another piece of content. So how can we like connect stories to people so they can understand how it's affecting their lives and like what they can do about it?
Yeah, I think you're hitting on one thing. I think one is, focusing on stories of hope and modeling that and modeling solutions. And I know that as we go forward with short form content, we want to move beyond just talking about the problem, and we want to start, showing examples of the people that are actually solving it to show that it is possible. And Bree's done that a lot with the Changemaker series. So I think hope makes a difference. And then in terms of like connecting it to their personal lives, I think that's just understanding how different sets of people lives are on social media, and so actually featuring different kinds of people in your stories, talking about their experiences can help connect those dots a little bit more. And I think so. Yeah, I think we can just open it up broadly to anyone who has a question. So if you do, just feel free to unmute yourself and pop on, and yeah, we're here to talk.
Actually, yeah, I have a question. Actually, I was just about to type it in, but great. Well, as you find these stories and you conduct these interviews, have you come across actually some interviews or interviewees that may have not actually been true? And if so, have you also then, how do you then verify their stories? Like, how do you confirm, oh, this actually happened or this is actually true?
Right. Yeah, I know that our production team does a really thorough fact-checking process. And so that's something to think about as you're doing a documentary about how you're going to engage in that. And so they do try to vet all of that, just like any good journalism practice, to make sure things happen. And I can't speak specifically whether that happened in this film. I know in my past in broadcast journalism, that's certainly happened. You have to kind of understand what people's agendas are too. And if, you have to kind of put yourself in their shoes. And so that'll make you research better. But sometimes, mistakes are made, and you'll see that in the news, and they'll write out, corrections. So, but yeah, you're hitting on something that's truly important, that you can't just take everyone at their word. And when you're doing a documentary and telling someone's story, you do need to check the facts as best you can.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
But that's also like a big sort of challenge, because it is something that can be intangible, and it's also a lot of background story of family and friends. And can they verify this story?
Right.
And
There's only, yeah. There's only so much you can do, but anything that's publicly available online, you'll do. And then I think too, just trust your instincts as a storyteller. If something feels off, if you're giving an interview and you're just feeling like a little bit weird about what's going on, trust that, and see what else you can find out. Or if you have a major doubt, like maybe you cut that interview. I mean, it's, these are the hard decisions you have to make. But once you put it out there and it's public, like, the consequences are real. So if you're feeling anything just in your body as you're interviewing someone, maybe they're not right for your film.
okay, thank you. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
I can ask another one. So I'm wondering, like, especially with the social dilemma, I guess it was so important to have an impact team, because so what do you think the responsibility is if you're reviewing like this huge problem or something that's, really emotional, of giving people the resources to be able to work on something afterwards and take action?
I can jump in. You want to, Brie?
You can go first, and then I'll add on. Yeah.
I love that, Ryan. I think, and you're hitting on just sort of the central mission of Exposure Labs. They actually, that's kind of like how the whole thing started. And actually, Brie probably knows this better, but, or maybe not. Actually, it was even before your time, maybe. But I know when their first film coming out with Chasing Ice, which was talking about the degradation of, our ice caps and melting due to climate change, the team would go to these screenings, and people would watch the film and they say, what can we do? And I think that they realized in that process, oh my gosh, we have to give people something to do. And there is this appetite to do more. And that's how the whole concept of creating a long-term impact team really started. And they really started that work with Chasing Coral and sustained it. So I mean, this is where it gets hard. We are privileged. We're lucky that we have the resources to have an impact team. Most film teams don't. And so they really can just only share the problem and that, or, whatever their findings were in the film. And that's still very helpful, right? I mean, but I think that wherever you can to give people resources, give them an action to take, they are craving that. And even if it's something simple, while you have their attention right after they watch the film, if you can serve them with just something that they can do in that moment, that can, really help create the seeds for change.
Absolutely, Julia. I'll just second that. I think like determining the role of the film is really essential in that. And then, our audience and, and determining just like who you want to reach and why, and then really positioning yourself that way is really key. And as Julia said, like in that process as impact producers, like we are really keen on listening and learning and figuring out what the needs are of folks who want to join our campaigns. And that's a big part of what we do is just weave those people together and connect them to our campaign and resources and again what they are looking for. So I think that's just one thing that it energizes me as an impact producer in the work is really getting specific on what that looks like on a given story.
And I actually have one more thing to ask. This is sort of like I want you guys to imagine, like as impact producers, if you guys were impact producers at like Facebook, at those companies, what would you guys do? Or like, what do you imagine doing?
Ooh. I love that question.
Good one.
We as a team, Meta or Facebook, used to have this slogan that they ran their business by is move fast and break things. And as a team, just as we built this campaign and in our own engagement strategy, we want to move slow and fix things. And so that has been a mantra of mine in the engagement work and thinking about the impact is just like, how can we like work on the inside to resolve these tools and make them serve the benefit of humanity over an exploitive business model just for the sake of profit.
Totally. And just to piggyback on that, this doesn't exactly answer your question, but one thing too to keep in mind about stories and public pressure really do make a change. We hear all the time, kind of through the grapevine, that employees within the companies feel emboldened to speak out to their bosses or maybe leak documents or whatever the case may be, because there's public pressure, because there's this groundswell of anger out there. It becomes almost shameful to work at these companies and not try to do something to fix these things. So I think that I would almost lean on some of the work. There's been plenty of employees within these companies that are actively right now talking to their bosses, whether that's quietly or whether that's publicly, people are doing things. And so I guess if we were impact producers there, we would try to be on the side of, explaining how things change.
Here's an unexpected thing also that I just learned. As someone who's in the inbox, I received an email, just revealed how old I might be getting. And it was actually a church in Silicon Valley who thinks that they have a really great opportunity to start a conversation with those in the community that are connected to those organizations. And again, it's just an unexpected audience, an unexpected messenger, a trusted messenger who is fostering that story and shepherding that into the community. And I think I'm excited to see, how that plays out in Silicon Valley.
So I have a question. I'm thinking about how popular podcasts are right now. And if you have any sort of tips or perspectives on how the message may shift or anything specific about, podcasting and whether being a host of it or speaking on it, in that perspective of change agency.
Yeah, podcasts and audio storytelling are so powerful. I know it's something we've considered and we ultimately decided for now just to stay in our wheelhouse of making videos. But for anyone considering audio storytelling as a tool, I think it's incredibly effective. There's something so intimate about audio storytelling that is actually, I think, even more intimate than watching a video. It's like someone's in your home or in your ears, a friend telling you something. So for anyone thinking about that, I think lean into the medium itself and be intimate and be, make yourself like like the friend that's talking to your audience, because I think that's how you build trust with them. But yeah, podcasts are fantastic and definitely a great tool for storytelling and making change.
I have a question, but I want to make sure if there's anybody in the audience who has one, because I feel like we probably have time for answering maybe one or two more. So I'll pause and just say you can unmute yourself, or you can send it to me privately and I'll read it anonymously to Bree and Julia. I have that like Jeopardy music playing in my head right now as I wait for the question to come in.
Power of the pause.
So I guess my question is sort of this, when you're creating a documentary, and in particular, this one is about technology, it's something that changes so quickly. How do you balance, like, creating a documentary that captures a moment in time and kind of that experience in time while the movement is changing, kind of the experience is changing? How do you balance that as that documentary kind of lives on in its final state?
Yeah, it's a great question. I know it's something the production team did kind of grapple with a lot. And as they were making the film, it was, you do these interviews like 2 or 3 years before the film comes out. And so much can change. So sometimes you do go back to an interviewee to see what's changed. And I know that Tim Kendall in the film, who ended up saying that he was worried about, these platforms causing civil war, actually did the interview twice because he'd seen kind of things that are happening and was like, I need to tell more. Like, I think that there are more problems here we need to discuss. So sometimes you actually have time to go back and interview someone again. But I think the most important thing is that I think at one point I've heard our director and producer, Jeff and Larissa, talk about this in other conversations, but they were seeing the news come in. I think this was when Apple came out with like that time tracker that tells you how long you've been on your screen. And that was actually like a big deal at the time. And that happened. And they were like, is this film going to be relevant? They had those moments, but ultimately, because they were talking about the business model and they centered in on that and how the business model causes these harms, that doesn't change until like regulation, all this other stuff happens. So because that was a central thesis, new news may come out. You can incorporate as much as you can in the production of the film, but the thesis and the things stayed the same. So I would say, even if you're doing something newsy, try to find that evergreen core that can remain the same as the news changes. Because you know what, it does happen at a certain point. There's a cutoff time. You have to get your file out to your distributor and you need to start making translations, and you just have to call the film done. And more news is going to come out, but that's also why we have the impact campaign and we can tell more stories. But that is the danger. I mean, I know so many friends in the documentary film space that like started making a film, something happened in the news and their film became irrelevant. Like, it does happen, and it's a heartbreaking part of documentary filmmaking. But I think if you can find sort of an evergreen theme, you have a better shot of remaining relevant when your film comes out.
I'll just add on to that, as as the campaign launches and the impact campaign, as the film launches and the impact campaign begins, ways that we engage to keep the story new and fresh has been starting online conversations and asking experts to join us in those conversations and lifting up new voices in the movement that we weren't necessarily able to highlight in the film. That's a big one for us, as well as just ensuring that we continue to, keep tabs on the movement and share what we're learning with our audience constantly. And that's what we do online. And around that, like, we wrote opinion pieces as well, our film team, to just really like bring attention in those moments to what Julia said, that one big thing, the fundamental piece of the puzzle that you're trying to solve.
It's a great point, Bree.
Thank you. I love that idea of going back to somebody and kind of following up. That's just so appealing to me. I want to make sure there's no final questions before I give thanks. I know that this has been probably a lot of information and sort of like a lot of musings, and it's just really interesting topic to kind of take in. I like the move slow and fix things. I love mantras and mottos like that. I just think that's great. So I will say a huge thank you, Julia and Bree, for leading us through the whole TSD story and for bringing in the innovators that you're working with. So Yoelle, Michele, Ryan, thank you so much for being here and leading questions. I know we're extremely excited that you could be here. I also just want to call out that I think we've got Daniel and Jamelia also on here, who are a couple of our other innovators. So feel free to wave. It's an incredible cohort. We're really excited to have 2 social dilemma teams. We recorded this session, so we'll kind of put a little bow on it, and we will share it out with you all and with everybody who registered. And I think there's a lot of things in here that I would want to go back and listen to a second time. So you can look for that. And with that, we'll also send information on our next event, which is going to be April 28th with TikToker Callista Dwyer, who TikToks about mental health. So kind of continuing the conversation. Susan, thank you for joining us in the middle of the night. And I hope everybody has a great rest of their Wednesday. Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Bree.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.